Margaret Chen stood backstage at the Grand Hotel ballroom, smoothing down her simple black dress. Her hands were shaking a little. She had played piano at charity events before, but this one was different. This was the Harrison Foundation Gala, where the richest people in the city came to donate money and be seen doing it. She was 34 years old and had been teaching piano at Lincoln Community Music School for almost 10 years. The pay was not great, but she loved her job. She loved seeing children's faces light up when they finally played a song correctly. She loved the sound of music filling the small practice rooms. Tonight she was here to play 3 classical pieces during dinner. The foundation was paying her $500, which would help cover her rent for the month. Margaret peeked through the curtain at the crowd. Women wore glittering dresses that probably cost more than she made in a year. Men in expensive suits talked and laughed, holding glasses of wine. She felt out of place, but she reminded herself that she was here to do a job. She was good at playing piano. That was what mattered. The event coordinator, a thin woman with a tight smile, waved at her. "You're on in 2 minutes. Remember, keep it light and pleasant. These people are here to talk and eat, not to have a concert." Margaret nodded. She had heard this before at events like this. Her music was background noise to these people. That was fine. She sat at the beautiful grand piano on the small stage and placed her fingers on the keys. The ivory felt smooth and cool. This piano was much nicer than the old upright she practiced on at home. She began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The notes flowed from her fingers naturally. She had played this piece 1,000 times. As she played, the chatter in the room continued. People barely looked at her. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates of expensive food. Margaret closed her eyes and let the music take over. This was the part she loved. When she played, nothing else existed. What Margaret did not know was that one person in the room had stopped talking completely. Richard Westmore, sitting at table 7 near the back, had frozen with his fork halfway to his mouth. He was staring at the woman at the piano with an expression his dinner companions had never seen before. His eyes were wide and his usually stern face had softened. Richard was 72 years old and one of the wealthiest men in the state. He had built his fortune in manufacturing, starting with a small factory and growing it into an empire. He owned 12 factories now, employed thousands of people, and had more money than he could ever spend. He had been married to his wife, Catherine, for 42 years before she died 5 years ago. Since then, he had thrown himself into work, rarely taking time for anything else. But right now, work was the furthest thing from his mind. He was listening to this woman play piano, and something inside his chest felt tight. The music was beautiful. It reminded him of something he had forgotten existed. It reminded him of feeling something other than tired. When Margaret finished the piece, Richard did something unusual. He started clapping, loudly. The people at his table looked at him in surprise. Nobody else was clapping. This was background music, but Richard did not care. He kept clapping until a few other people joined in awkwardly. Margaret looked up, startled. She saw an older man with gray hair and sharp blue eyes clapping enthusiastically. He was smiling at her, a real smile that reached his eyes. She gave a small nod of thanks and started her next piece. During the break between her performances, Margaret stepped outside to the balcony for some fresh air. The night was cool and the city lights sparkled below. She leaned against the railing and took a deep breath. 2 more pieces to play, and then she could go home to her small apartment and her cat. "Excuse me." Margaret turned around. It was the man who had been clapping. Up close she could see he was tall and well-dressed in an expensive suit. His face had deep lines, but his eyes were kind. "I hope I did not startle you," he said. "I wanted to tell you that your playing was extraordinary. That Chopin piece, it has been years since I heard it played with such feeling." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. That's very kind of you to say." "I am Richard Westmore," he said, extending his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm but gentle. "Margaret Chen, nice to meet you." "Do you play professionally?" Richard asked. "I teach piano at a community music school," Margaret said. "I play at events like this sometimes to make extra money." "A teacher," Richard said, nodding. "That is admirable work. I always wished I had learned to play an instrument when I was young." "It's never too late," Margaret said automatically. It was something she told adult students all the time. Richard laughed, but it was not a mean laugh. "I am 72 years old. My fingers do not work as well as they used to." I think that ship has sailed. I have students in their 60s and 70s, Margaret said. If you really wanted to learn, you could. It just takes patience and practice. Richard looked at her curiously. You really believe that? Of course. Music is for everyone, not just young people. Before Richard could respond, the event coordinator appeared. Miss Chen, you need to come back inside. You're on again in 5 minutes. Margaret nodded and gave Richard a polite smile. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Westmore. Please call me Richard, he said. And Miss Chen, would it be possible to get your contact information? I would like to speak with you more about piano lessons. Margaret was surprised. She pulled out one of her business cards from her small purse. The cards were simple, just her name and phone number and the name of the music school. Richard took it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. I will call you, he promised. Margaret went back inside thinking he probably would not. Rich men said things like that all the time and never followed through. But she was wrong. Richard called her the very next day. They met for coffee at a small cafe near the music school. Richard arrived exactly on time, wearing casual clothes that still somehow looked expensive. Margaret wore jeans and a sweater. She felt underdressed, but Richard did not seem to notice or care. Thank you for meeting me, Richard said as they sat down with their coffee. I wanted to ask you seriously about piano lessons. I know it sounds foolish at my age, but your playing last night reminded me of something I gave up on long ago. What's that? Margaret asked. Beauty, Richard said simply. I spent my whole life building a business, making money, being successful, and somehow I forgot about things like music and art and just enjoying something for its own sake. Margaret stirred her coffee. It's not foolish at all. I think it's brave to want to learn something new. They talked for 2 hours. Richard told her about his factories, his late wife, his 3 children who ran parts of his business now. He told her that since Catherine died, his life had felt empty. He worked, came home to his big house, and worked some more. He attended charity events and business dinners, but nothing felt meaningful. Margaret told him about growing up in a small apartment where the walls were thin and practicing piano quietly, so she would not bother the neighbors. She told him about scraping together money for college, about her students who came from poor families but had so much talent. She told him about the joy she felt when a struggling student finally understood something. When they parted ways, they had agreed to weekly piano lessons. Richard would come to the music school on Saturday mornings. He insisted on paying 3 times her normal rate, not because he thought her time was not valuable, but because he wanted to support the school. The first lesson was awkward. Richard's fingers were stiff from arthritis. He got frustrated easily. He was a man used to being good at things, and piano was hard. But Margaret was patient. She had him do simple exercises. She praised small victories. By the end of the hour, Richard had played a very basic scale. That was terrible, Richard said, but he was smiling. That was a first step, Margaret corrected. Every pianist starts exactly where you are now. Will you really teach someone as old and clumsy as me? Richard asked. I will teach anyone who really wants to learn, Margaret said. Age does not matter. Only effort matters. Richard looked at her for a long moment. You are a remarkable person, Margaret Chen. The lessons continued. Every Saturday morning, Richard showed up with his practice notes from the week. He had bought a piano for his house, an expensive grand piano that he practiced on every evening. His fingers slowly became less stiff. His playing slowly improved. But something else was happening too. After lessons, they started talking. Then the talks became lunch. Then Richard asked if Margaret would like to go to a concert with him. Then another concert. Then dinners. Then walks in the park. Richard's life, which had felt colorless and mechanical, suddenly had light in it again. He found himself smiling for no reason. He looked forward to Saturdays like a child looks forward to Christmas. Margaret made him laugh. She challenged him when he was impatient with himself. She listened to his stories about business and seemed genuinely interested. She was smart and kind and passionate about music. Margaret, for her part, was surprised by how much she enjoyed Richard's company. He was intelligent and curious. He asked thoughtful questions. He treated her with respect, not like she was beneath him because she was younger or made less money. When she talked about her students, he listened carefully and later remembered details, asking about specific children by name. 6 months after they met, Richard took Margaret to an expensive restaurant. She wore her nicest dress, which was still quite simple compared to what other women in the restaurant wore. Richard wore a suit but had left his tie at home because Margaret once mentioned she found ties too formal and stiff. Over dinner, Richard cleared his throat nervously. Margaret had never seen him nervous before. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, and I am worried about how you will react." Margaret's heart sank. Was he sick? Was something wrong? "I am an old man," Richard continued. "I am 73 now. You are 34. I know how that looks. I know what people would say." Margaret started to understand where this was going. Her heart started beating faster. "But these past 6 months have been the happiest I have been in years. Maybe the happiest I have ever been. You make me want to be better. You make me want to keep learning, keep growing. I look forward to seeing you more than anything else in my life." Richard reached across the table and took her hand. "I am not good at romantic speeches. I am just a businessman who makes factories and products. But I would like to be more in your life if you would let me. I know the age difference is unusual, but—" "Richard," Margaret interrupted gently. "I care about you too." Richard's face showed so much relief and joy that Margaret almost laughed. "You do?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I was worried you just saw me as your piano teacher or a young friend. I did not think you would be interested in me as more. More is exactly what I want," Richard said firmly. "If you will have me." They dated for 3 more months. Richard wanted to take things slowly. He wanted to be sure Margaret really understood what being with him meant. He was not just an old man. He was a very wealthy, very visible old man. People would talk. People would judge. His family might not understand. "My children," Richard said one evening as they sat in his living room, "they might not react well. They loved their mother very much. They might think I am replacing her." "Are you?" Margaret asked quietly. "No," Richard said. "Catherine was the love of my youth. She gave me 42 good years and 3 wonderful children. But she is gone and I am still here. I do not think she would want me to be alone and miserable for the rest of my life. And you, Margaret, you are different from Catherine. You are your own person. I am not trying to recreate what I had. I am trying to build something new." Margaret understood. She also knew that people would judge her. They would say she was after his money. They would say terrible things. But when she looked at Richard, she saw a good man who made her laugh, who practiced piano even when his fingers hurt, who remembered the names of her students, who donated money to her school without being asked, who treated her like an equal. "I do not care what people say," Margaret told him. "If you do not care, then I do not care." Richard kissed her forehead. "You are braver than I am." They married 4 months later. It was a small ceremony at the courthouse. Richard had wanted to invite his children, but when he told them about Margaret, the conversation had not gone well. His oldest daughter, Victoria, had been coldest. "Dad, you have known this woman for less than a year. She is almost 40 years younger than you. Can you not see what this looks like?" "It looks like I found someone who makes me happy," Richard had said. "She is after your money," Victoria said bluntly. "I am sorry to say it, but someone has to. You are vulnerable right now. You miss Mom. This woman is taking advantage of that." "Margaret has never asked me for anything," Richard said. "Not yet," Victoria replied. "Just wait." His son James was more diplomatic but no less opposed. "Dad, I am happy you have a companion. But marriage? That seems extreme. Why not just date? Why rush into legal commitment?" His youngest daughter Elizabeth had cried. "It feels like you are trying to replace Mom, like she meant nothing." Richard tried to explain. He tried to make them understand, but they would not listen. They refused to come to the wedding. They refused to meet Margaret. They made it clear that they thought their father was making a terrible mistake. So Richard and Margaret got married with just 2 friends as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple white dress she bought from a department store. Richard wore his best suit. The ceremony took 15 minutes. Afterward, they went to Margaret's favorite small Italian restaurant for dinner. It was not fancy, but the food was good and the owners knew Margaret by name. "Are you sad they did not come?" Margaret asked as they ate. "Yes," Richard admitted. "But I understand. They are protecting me, or they think they are. Maybe in time they will see that you are not what they think you are." "And if they do not?" Margaret asked. Richard took her hand. "Then that is their loss. I chose you, Margaret. I choose you now. I will choose you tomorrow and every day after that. Margaret squeezed his hand. She knew their life together would not be easy. She knew the challenges that were coming. But sitting there in that small restaurant with her new husband, eating pasta and talking about which piano piece he should learn next, she felt happy. Truly happy. Richard felt it too. For the first time in 5 years, he felt like he had a partner again, someone to share his days with, someone who cared about him as Richard, not as Richard Westmore the billionaire. They had no idea that their happiness would be tested so severely in the months ahead. They did not know that Richard's time was shorter than they hoped. They did not know that Margaret would face cruelty and accusations that would test her strength in ways she never imagined. But on that day, sitting in that restaurant, they were just two people who had found each other against all odds. An old man who wanted to learn piano and a young woman who believed it was never too late to start something new. Together they were happy. And for that moment, that was enough. The first few weeks of marriage were wonderful but strange. Margaret moved into Richard's large house, a mansion really, in the wealthy part of the city. She had lived her whole life in small apartments where you could hear your neighbors through the walls. Now she lived in a house with 12 rooms, a library, a formal dining room, and a backyard bigger than the park near her old apartment. The house felt empty and cold at first. Everything was expensive and perfectly arranged. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. The kitchen had appliances Margaret did not know how to use. There was a housekeeper named Rosa, who came 3 times a week, and Rosa seemed surprised that Margaret wanted to do her own laundry and cooking. "Mrs. Westmore, that is what I am here for," Rosa said kindly when she found Margaret washing dishes. "Please call me Margaret," she said. "And I like doing dishes. It helps me think." Rosa smiled but looked uncertain. Catherine Westmore had never washed her own dishes. Richard noticed that Margaret seemed uncomfortable. One evening he found her standing in the large living room looking lost. "What is wrong?" he asked. "This does not feel like home yet," Margaret admitted. "Everything is so formal and perfect. I am afraid to touch anything." Richard looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Catherine decorated this house 30 years ago. I never changed anything after she died. I suppose it is like living in a museum." "I do not want to erase her memory," Margaret said quickly. "This was her home." "It was," Richard agreed. "But now it is your home too. Change whatever you want. Make it feel comfortable. Catherine would not want you to feel like a guest in your own house." So Margaret started making small changes. She bought colorful throw pillows for the stiff formal couches. She put plants on the windowsills. She hung some of her own artwork, simple prints she had collected over the years. Nothing expensive, nothing fancy, but things that made her smile. The biggest change was the music room. Richard had a whole room dedicated to his new grand piano. Margaret moved in a comfortable chair, good lighting for reading sheet music, and a small bookshelf for their growing collection of piano books. She put up a bulletin board where they could pin notes and practice schedules. Soon the room felt lived in and warm, with sheet music scattered on the piano and 2 coffee mugs usually sitting on the side table. Margaret insisted on keeping her job at the music school. Richard had suggested she could quit, that she did not need to work anymore. But Margaret refused. "I love teaching," she told him. "Those kids need me. And I need them. That job is part of who I am." Richard respected that even though he did not fully understand it at first. He was used to people who stopped working the moment they had enough money. But he came to see that for Margaret, teaching was not about money. It was about purpose. 3 mornings a week, Margaret drove her old car to the community music school. Richard had offered to buy her a new car, something safe and reliable. She had refused that too. "My car works fine," she said. "There are better things to spend money on." "Like what?" Richard asked, amused. "Like new instruments for the school. Like scholarships for students who cannot afford lessons. Like fixing the leak in the roof of the practice rooms." Richard stared at her. "You want me to donate to your school instead of buying you a car?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "That would make me much happier than a new car." So Richard made a large donation to Lincoln Community Music School. The director cried when she received the check. They could finally fix the roof, buy 3 new pianos, and offer full scholarships to 10 students. Margaret did not tell anyone at the school that the donation came from her husband. She did not want special treatment or attention, but word got around anyway. Small communities always have gossip. Soon people knew that Margaret Chen had married a billionaire. Her co-workers' attitudes changed. Some were genuinely happy for her. Others seemed jealous or suspicious. A few stopped talking to her altogether. One day, her colleague Jennifer cornered her in the break room. "So you do not need this job anymore, right? When are you quitting?" "I am not quitting," Margaret said, pouring coffee. "Come on," Jennifer said with a bitter laugh. "You hit the lottery. Old rich husband. Why would you keep working here for $30,000 a year?" Margaret turned to face her. "Because I love teaching. Because these kids matter to me. My life circumstances changed, but I did not change." "Sure," Jennifer said, but her tone suggested she did not believe it. Margaret felt the sting of that conversation for days. She had thought her co-workers were her friends. Now she realized some of them had never really known her at all. If they had, they would understand that money could not replace the feeling of watching a child play their first song or seeing a teenager discover a passion for music. At home, things were better. Margaret and Richard fell into a comfortable routine. Richard still went to his office 3 days a week to oversee his business. On those days, Margaret taught at the school. The other days they spent together. They cooked meals with Margaret teaching Richard simple recipes. They read books in the library, sitting in comfortable silence. They took walks in the nearby park, holding hands like young people even though Richard walked slowly and sometimes needed to rest. And every evening, they played music. Richard's piano skills were improving slowly. His fingers were stiff from arthritis and some days they hurt too much to practice. But he kept trying. Margaret was endlessly patient with him, breaking down difficult passages into tiny pieces, celebrating when he got through a measure without mistakes. "I am terrible at this," Richard said one evening after struggling with a simple Mozart piece. "You are learning," Margaret corrected. "That is different from being terrible. You are making progress every week." "I will never be good," Richard said. "Define good," Margaret challenged. "If good means playing in concert halls, maybe not. But if good means being able to play music that brings you joy, then yes, you will be good. You already are." Richard looked at his wife, this woman who believed in him so completely. "How did I find you?" "You came to the right charity event," Margaret said, smiling. "And you were brave enough to ask for piano lessons." "Best decision I ever made," Richard said. On weekends, they explored the city together. Margaret showed Richard places he had never been despite living there his whole life. Small cafes with amazing coffee, used bookstores with hidden treasures, parks with beautiful gardens, street musicians performing for spare change. A whole world existed that Richard had been too busy to notice before. Richard showed Margaret his world too. They attended the symphony sitting in his box seats. They went to art gallery openings. They had dinner with some of Richard's business associates. Margaret felt out of place at these fancy events. The other women wore designer clothes and expensive jewelry. They talked about country clubs and vacation homes. Margaret wore simple dresses and talked about her students when anyone bothered to ask. Most people did not bother. They looked at Margaret with curiosity or barely hidden judgment. She was obviously much younger than Richard. She was obviously not from their world. The assumption was clear in their eyes. Gold digger. One particularly awful evening, a woman named Patricia Thornton made her opinion known. They were at a charity gala, similar to the one where Richard and Margaret had met. Patricia was a socialite who had known Richard and Catherine for decades. "Richard, darling," Patricia said, air-kissing both his cheeks. "How nice to see you." She turned to Margaret with a thin smile. "And this must be your companion." "My wife," Richard said firmly. "Margaret, this is Patricia Thornton." "Your wife," Patricia repeated, looking Margaret up and down. "How modern. And what do you do, dear?" "I teach piano," Margaret said. "How sweet," Patricia said in a tone that made it sound like anything but. "I am sure Richard appreciates having someone to play for him. Catherine never was musical, you know. She had other talents. Charity work, hosting, managing Richard's social calendar. She was quite accomplished, the implication was clear. You are not." Margaret felt her face grow hot, but before she could respond, Richard spoke coldly. "Margaret is accomplished in ways that matter," he said. "She changes children's lives. She gives them opportunities they would not otherwise have. That is worth more than any social calendar." Patricia's smile froze. "Of course. How charitable of her. Well, I must circulate. Lovely to see you, Richard." She walked away without saying goodbye to Margaret. "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly. Patricia has always been vicious. I should have warned you. It is fine, Margaret said, but it was not fine. That whole evening she felt people staring at her and whispering. She saw the judgment in their eyes. Young woman. Old man. Money. The math was simple to them. In the car on the way home, Margaret was quiet. Talk to me, Richard said. Do you ever wonder if they are right? Margaret asked. Right about what? About me, about us? Maybe I am taking advantage of you without realizing it. Richard pulled the car over and turned to face her. Margaret, look at me. You have never asked me for anything. I try to buy you gifts and you redirect the money to your school. I offer you a new car, you say no. I want to take you on expensive vacations, you suggest camping trips instead. If you are taking advantage of me, you are doing a terrible job of it. Margaret smiled a little. I suppose that is true. He decided to make sure his will was ironclad. He visited his lawyer, Gerald Morrison, and updated everything. He made provisions that would protect Margaret no matter what. And he added a special clause, something he had been thinking about for weeks. Are you sure about this? Gerald asked after hearing Richard's plan. Completely sure, Richard said. My children think Margaret married me for money. When I am gone, they need to understand the truth. This will help them see it. Gerald made the changes. Richard signed the papers. He felt better knowing that his wishes would be honored. At home, Richard was happier than ever. He and Margaret had found a rhythm to their life. They understood each other. They made each other laugh. They supported each other's dreams and interests. Richard convinced Margaret to play more public concerts. He sat in the audience at everyone, beaming with pride. After each performance, he brought her flowers. Not expensive roses from a fancy shop, but wildflowers he picked himself from their garden. Margaret encouraged Richard to keep learning piano. She found easier arrangements of complex pieces so he could play music he loved. She recorded him when he played something well so he could hear his progress. They talked about traveling. Richard wanted to take Margaret to Europe, to show her the great concert halls and musical landmarks. They planned a trip for the following summer. Vienna, Prague, Paris. Margaret was excited but also nervous. She had never been abroad before. We will go slowly, Richard promised. No rushing. We will see what you want to see, not just the tourist spots. I want to see where famous composers lived, Margaret said. I want to visit the places where they created their music. Then that is what we will do, Richard said. But they never got to take that trip. 2 months after planning it, Richard started having health problems. It started with fatigue. Richard felt tired all the time. He thought it was just old age, but Margaret noticed he was more tired than usual. She convinced him to see his doctor. The doctor ran tests and found that Richard's heart condition, which had been stable for years, was getting worse. The medication was not working as well as it should. They adjusted his prescriptions and told him to reduce stress and get more rest. Richard followed orders for about a week before going back to his normal routine. He had a business to run after all, Margaret scolded him. The doctor said rest, she said. You need to slow down. I am fine, Richard insisted. But he was not fine. One evening, while practicing piano, he felt dizzy and short of breath. Margaret called an ambulance immediately. At the hospital, the doctors explained that Richard's heart was failing. They could manage it with medication and lifestyle changes, but his heart was weak. He needed to take it very seriously. Richard spent 3 days in the hospital. Margaret never left his side. She slept in the uncomfortable chair next to his bed. She helped him walk to the bathroom. She read to him when he could not sleep. She called his children to tell them their father was in the hospital. Victoria, James, and Elizabeth all came to visit. It was the first time they had seen Margaret in person since Richard announced his marriage. The hospital room was tense. They spoke to their father but ignored Margaret as much as possible. When Richard fell asleep, exhausted from their visit, Elizabeth finally looked at Margaret. How long has he been having symptoms? She asked not unkindly. A few weeks, Margaret said. He kept saying he was fine. I finally made him go to the doctor. You should have made him go sooner, Victoria said sharply. Margaret took a breath. She was too tired to argue. You are right. I should have. Her agreement seemed to surprise Victoria. The room fell quiet again. When Richard was released from the hospital, he had strict orders. Light activity only, no stress. Regular checkups. Margaret became his protector, making sure he followed every rule. She prepared heart-healthy meals. She went on slow walks with him. She monitored his medication schedule. Richard tried to stay positive, but Margaret could see the fear in his eyes. He was facing his mortality, and it scared him. Not dying itself, he said, but leaving Margaret alone. "What will you do when I am gone?" he asked her one night. "Do not talk like that," Margaret said. "You are going to be fine. Margaret, be realistic. I am 73 with a failing heart. We need to talk about this." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. "Then we will talk." "What do you want to say?" "I want you to promise me something," Richard said. "When I am gone, do not let my children bully you. Do not let them make you feel small or unworthy. You are neither of those things." "I promise," Margaret said, though she could not imagine standing up to Victoria and her siblings. "I have made arrangements," Richard continued. "Everything is in order. You will be taken care of. My lawyer knows my wishes. Just trust that I have thought of everything." Margaret nodded, tears running down her face. She did not want to think about losing Richard. These 2.5 years with him had been the happiest of her life. The thought of going back to being alone was unbearable. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Richard said. "You gave me something I thought I had lost forever. You gave me music and laughter and purpose. You taught me it is never too late to learn something new. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They held each other that night, both knowing that their time was limited but neither wanting to say it out loud. Richard's health improved a bit with the new treatment and Margaret's careful attention. He had good days and bad days. On good days, they sat together and he played piano, his fingers moving slowly but surely over the keys. On bad days, Margaret played for him while he rested in his chair, listening with his eyes closed. The piano had become the center of their life together. It was where they communicated without words. It was where Richard felt accomplished, despite his failing body. It was where Margaret poured out her love and worry in music. One afternoon, Richard called Margaret into the music room. He had been practicing in secret, which worried her because he was supposed to be resting. But when she entered the room, she saw him sitting at the piano with a determined look on his face. "I want to play something for you," he said. "Richard, you should be resting. Please," he interrupted. "This is important. I have been working on this for weeks." Margaret sat in her chair, concerned but curious. Richard placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. It was Schumann's Träumerei, a piece they had talked about many times. It was one of Richard's favorites, but also difficult, especially for someone with his limited skill and arthritis. He played it slowly and carefully. There were mistakes, pauses where he had to remember what came next, moments where his fingers did not quite hit the right keys. But he played it all the way through. Every note, every measure. When he finished, he looked at Margaret with tears in his eyes. "I did it," he said simply. Margaret rushed to him and wrapped her arms around him. She was crying too. "You did it. Richard, that was beautiful. I wanted to accomplish something real before." He did not finish the sentence. "You have accomplished so much," Margaret said. "You learned piano in your 70s. You worked every day despite the pain. You never gave up. I am so proud of you." Richard held her tight. "Will you play it with me? Can you create an accompaniment? Something simple that I can manage. I want us to play it together." "Of course," Margaret said. "We can record it too if you want. To remember this moment." "Yes," Richard said. "Let's do that." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret arranged a simplified accompaniment part for Träumerei. She made it match Richard's tempo and ability. They practiced together every day, Richard playing the melody while Margaret supported him with gentle harmonies underneath. Finally, they were ready to record. Margaret set up her phone to capture the sound. They played through the piece twice to warm up, then did their recording take. It was not perfect, but it was beautiful in its imperfection. It was real and heartfelt, two people making music together. After they finished, Richard wanted to record a message. He had an idea, he said. Something he wanted his children to hear someday. Margaret recorded him speaking, though she did not fully understand why at the time. "To my children," Richard said to the camera, "if you are hearing this, I am gone, and I suspect you are angry about my will." He spoke for several minutes, explaining his marriage to Margaret, his wishes for his estate, and his hopes that his children would understand. Margaret listened with tears streaming down her face. Richard was preparing for the end, making sure his voice would be heard even after he was gone. A week after they made the recording, Richard's health took a sharp turn. He collapsed in the hallway, and this time the ambulance rushed him to intensive care. His heart was failing rapidly. The doctors did what they could, but Richard's body was wearing out. Margaret lived at the hospital for the next 3 weeks. She left only to shower and change clothes, then rushed back. She held Richard's hand. She read to him from his favorite books. She played recordings of piano music on her phone. She talked to him about their memories together, about the time they had shared, about how much he meant to her. Richard was conscious on and off. During his lucid moments, he squeezed Margaret's hand and tried to smile. Once he whispered, "No regrets. You are worth everything." His children visited more frequently as the end approached. He walked to the corner of the office where Margaret now noticed a large shape covered with a cloth. Gerald pulled the cloth away to reveal an upright piano. It was the piano from Richard's hospital room, the one he had requested during his final week so he could keep practicing. Richard had this brought here 2 weeks before he died, Gerald explained. He knew he would not be at the will reading, but he wanted this piano here for today. "Margaret, whenever you are ready." Margaret stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak. She walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. The keys looked blurry through her tears. She placed her hands on them and felt the familiar cool smoothness. She knew what Richard wanted her to play. It was Traumerei, the piece they had recorded together. She had the recording on her phone. Gerald had the speakers ready. But first, she needed to explain something. Margaret turned to face the 3 siblings. "I need to tell you something about this recording." Richard spent 2 years learning piano. It was very hard for him because of his arthritis. His fingers hurt all the time, but he never complained. He practiced every single day. Her voice broke, but she continued. About 6 weeks before he died, he finally played all the way through Traumerei by Schumann. It is not an easy piece. It took him months of work. When he finished, he cried. He was so proud of himself. Victoria was staring at her hands. James was listening intently. He asked me to arrange an accompaniment part, something simple that matched his ability. We practiced it together for 2 weeks. Then we recorded it. He wanted to surprise you all with it at Christmas. He wanted to play it at family dinner and show you what he had accomplished. Elizabeth made a soft sound of distress. We did not know. He never told us he was learning piano. He wanted it to be a surprise, Margaret said. A good surprise. Something to be proud of. She pulled out her phone and connected it to Gerald's speaker system. I am going to play my part now, the accompaniment, and the recording will play Richard's part, the melody. This is us playing together one last time. Margaret turned back to the piano. She placed her fingers on the keys and nodded to Gerald, who started the recording. For a moment there was silence. Then Richard's piano playing began, hesitant but determined, coming through the speakers. Margaret began to play her part, the gentle accompaniment she had written specifically for Richard. Her notes wove around his, supporting and enhancing his melody. The piece was slow and dreamlike, full of tenderness. Richard's playing had mistakes. Notes held too long, slight pauses, a few wrong keys, but it had heart. You could hear in every note how much effort he had put into learning this. As they played their duet, Margaret with her elegant technique and Richard with his earnest, imperfect melody, something shifted in the room. Victoria's face began to crumble. James put his head in his hands. Elizabeth was sobbing quietly. They could hear it now. Not just the notes, but what the music meant. It meant hours of practice. It meant patience and dedication. It meant an old man pushing through pain because something mattered to him. It meant someone believing in him enough to teach him, to encourage him, to celebrate with him when he finally succeeded. The piece continued, beautiful in its imperfection. This was not a performance for a concert hall. This was personal and intimate. This was love made audible. When the final notes faded, the only sound in the office was crying. All 4 of them were crying now. Even Gerald had tears in his eyes. Margaret sat at the piano, her hands still on the keys. She did not turn around. She could not bear to see their faces. Then she heard Gerald press another button. Richard's voice filled the room, the recording he had made that same day. His voice was weak but clear. To my children, Victoria, James, Elizabeth, if you are hearing this, I am gone. And I suspect you are not happy with me right now. I suspect you think Margaret has tricked me or manipulated me. So I want you to hear something. I want you to hear what your father accomplished because one woman believed in him. There was a pause, then Richard continued. That music you just heard represents 2 years of work. 2 years of Margaret coming to this house every Saturday without fail. 2 years of her patient teaching. 2 years of celebrating tiny victories and encouraging me when I wanted to give up. Margaret never asked me for money or gifts or anything material. What she asked for was my time and my effort. She asked me to practice. She asked me to try. She asked me to believe I could learn something new even though I am old and my hands do not work right anymore. Victoria was shaking her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I know you think Margaret married me for my wealth," Richard's voice said. "You have made that very clear. You never came to visit after we married. You never gave her a chance. You judged her without knowing her. And that hurt me more than you realize, because I wanted you to see what I saw in her. I wanted you to know how special she is. Let me tell you what Margaret did with my money. When I tried to buy her a luxury car, she asked me to donate to her music school instead. So I did. $20,000 for new instruments and roof repairs. When I wanted to buy her diamond earrings, she asked me to fund scholarships for poor students. So I did. 10 full scholarships for children who could not afford lessons. When I tried to take her on expensive vacations, she suggested we go camping in state parks because she wanted to save money for her students. When I offered to support her so she could quit her job, she refused because she loves teaching too much to stop. She makes $30,000 a year teaching piano to poor kids when she could have sat at home spending my money. Think about that. James was staring at Margaret's back, a look of dawning understanding on his face. Margaret took care of me when I got sick with a devotion that humbled me. She slept in a hospital chair for 3 weeks. She learned everything about my medications, my diet, my needs. She advocated for me with doctors. She held my hand when I was scared. She never complained, not once, about how hard it was. And this recording you just heard? This was Margaret's gift to me. She arranged this music specifically for my ability level. She practiced with me for hours. She celebrated with me when I finally played it all the way through. She made me feel accomplished and proud, something I had not felt in years. Richard's voice grew stronger. "I am leaving Margaret the house because she made it a home again. The house you grew up in had become a museum after your mother died, cold and untouched. Margaret brought warmth back into it. She put plants in the windows and comfortable blankets on the couches. She made it a place where I wanted to be, not just a place where I existed. I am leaving her $2 million because I want her to be financially secure, but I would bet any amount of money that within a year, she will have donated most of it to causes she cares about. That is who Margaret is. She gives. She does not take. The bulk of my estate goes to you as it should. You are my children and I love you. The business and investments are yours to manage through the trust. You will be very wealthy, more wealthy than you need to be. So please do not begrudge Margaret a small portion of what I built." There was another pause. Then Richard's voice became softer, sadder. "I wish things had been different. I wish you had come to know Margaret while I was alive. I wish we could have had family dinners together, holidays together, normal life together, but you chose not to. You chose to believe the worst instead of giving her a chance. I hope this recording helps you understand the truth. Margaret did not marry me for money. She married me because I was lonely and she was kind, because we both loved music, because we made each other happy. It is really that simple. If after hearing this you still want to contest the will and fight Margaret, that is your right. But I hope you will not. I hope you will see what I saw. I hope you will welcome her into this family as the daughter-in-law I wished she could have been while I was alive. One more thing. Margaret does not know this, but I changed my will one more time in my final weeks. If you contest this will and it goes to court, I have arranged for a full audit of how Margaret spent every penny she had access to during our marriage. Every transaction documented. Every donation recorded, because I want the court to see that she never bought anything expensive for herself. Never withdrew large sums. Never acted like someone trying to steal money." Gerald nodded. It was true. Richard had made sure everything was documented. I also made arrangements that if you contest the will, 20% of the trust income will go directly to Margaret's music school every year, forever. So by fighting her, you would be funding the cause she cares about most. I did this not to be cruel, but to protect her, to make sure that even if you destroy her reputation, her students still benefit. Victoria looked shocked. James closed his eyes. This changed everything. Fighting the will would actually help Margaret's cause. "I love you all," Richard's voice concluded. "My children and my wife. Please find a way to be family. Find a way to honor what Margaret and I had together. Learn from her. She has more wisdom in her little finger than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Be kind to her. That is my final request. Goodbye, my darlings. Live well. The recording ended. The office was silent except for quiet crying. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elizabeth stood up. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. I would like that very much. What about this Saturday? James suggested. We could meet at the house. Your house, he corrected himself. If that is okay with you. Yes, Margaret said. That would be perfect. They exchanged phone numbers and made plans. It felt surreal to Margaret. Just an hour ago she had expected a fight. Now she was planning family dinners. As they left the office building, stepping out into the cool afternoon air, Victoria stopped Margaret on the sidewalk. I have to ask you something, Victoria said. And please be honest. Okay, Margaret said nervously. Did you love him, my father? Did you really love him, or was it just companionship? Margaret looked Victoria in the eyes. I loved him very much. He made me laugh. He was curious about everything. He listened when I talked about my students and remembered their names. He brought me wildflowers from the garden because he knew I liked them better than expensive roses. He practiced piano even when his hands hurt because he did not want to disappoint me. Her voice grew thick with emotion. He was kind and thoughtful and brave. Brave enough to learn something new in his 70s. Brave enough to marry me despite knowing his children would be angry. Brave enough to face his death with dignity. How could I not love him? Victoria nodded slowly. Thank you. I needed to hear that. I needed to know it was real. It was real, Margaret said. Every moment of it was real. They said their goodbyes and went to their separate cars. Margaret sat in her old car for a long time before starting it. She felt emotionally drained but also strangely hopeful. Maybe Richard's children would become her family after all. Maybe something good could come from all this pain. She drove home slowly, back to the big house that felt so empty without Richard. But it felt a little less empty now. Now it held the possibility of family gatherings and shared memories and healing. As she pulled into the driveway, she thought about Richard's careful planning. He had known exactly what to do to help his children see the truth. Even in death, he was still protecting her, still caring for her, still making sure she would be okay. Margaret went inside and walked to the music room. Richard's piano sat there waiting. She sat down at the bench and placed her hands on the keys. Then she played Träumerei all the way through, her part and Richard's part combined into one piece. She played it perfectly, with all the skill and emotion she possessed. It was her goodbye to him, her thank you, her promise that she would honor his memory by continuing to teach, continuing to share music with children who needed it, continuing to be the person he had believed she was. When she finished, she sat quietly in the music room as the last notes faded. The afternoon sun came through the windows, making the piano glow. Margaret felt Richard's presence there, in the music, in the light, in the peace of the moment. I miss you, she whispered to the empty room. But I understand now what you were trying to do. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for teaching me that love does not need to make sense to other people, as long as it is real to us. She sat there until the sun began to set, surrounded by sheet music and memories and the lingering echo of a duet played by an old man who learned piano at 72 and the woman who believed he could. Gerald. Morrison cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes. He had been Richard's lawyer for over 30 years. He looked uncomfortable with the tension in the room. First, let me say how sorry I am for your loss, Gerald began. Richard was not only my client, but my friend. This is difficult for all of us. Victoria leaned forward impatiently. Can we please get on with it? Gerald nodded and opened the will document. Of course. Let me start by saying that Richard was very thorough in his planning. He made these arrangements over several months and was very clear about his wishes. This will was signed and witnessed properly. Everything is legally sound. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She felt numb, like she was watching this happen to someone else. Gerald began reading. I, Richard Charles Westmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The first section dealt with charitable donations. Richard had left money to several organizations he cared about. The symphony orchestra received a generous gift. The children's hospital where Catherine had volunteered got a substantial donation. Several scholarship funds were established. Margaret felt proud hearing this. It sounded like Richard, thinking of others even after death. Then Gerald moved to family bequests. To my daughter Victoria Ann Westmore, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $5 million to be distributed in yearly installments. Additionally, I leave her my collection of first edition books and my mother's jewelry. Victoria's face showed no emotion, but Margaret could see her shoulders relax slightly. $5 million was a lot of money, though less than she probably expected. To my son, James Robert Westmore, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $5 million to be distributed in yearly installments. Additionally, I leave him my vintage car collection and my father's pocket watch. James nodded slowly. He seemed satisfied with this arrangement. To my daughter Elizabeth Marie Westmore, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $5 million to be distributed in yearly installments. Additionally, I leave her my art collection and my wife Catherine's personal photographs and letters. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her mother's things. She nodded and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. $15 million total for his children. Margaret thought that was more than fair. More than generous, actually. But she could see from Victoria's expression that it was not what she expected. Victoria probably thought she would inherit the bulk of the estate. Gerald continued reading. To the employees of Westmore Industries who have been with the company for more than 10 years, I leave a bonus structure as follows. He read through several paragraphs of details about bonuses for long-term employees. Then came the part everyone was waiting for. Gerald paused and looked at Margaret with sympathy before reading. To my beloved wife, Margaret Chen Westmore, I leave the following. First, our home at 2847 Riverside Drive and all its contents, including all furniture, artwork, and personal effects. The house is to be hers completely with no strings attached and no requirements to maintain or share it with my children. Victoria made a noise of protest, but Gerald held up his hand. Please, let me finish. Second, I leave to Margaret my personal piano, my complete collection of sheet music and recordings, and all contents of the music room. Third, I leave to Margaret the sum of $2 million, to be given to her immediately with no restrictions on its use. The room exploded. Victoria stood up, her face red. $2 million? And the house? That house is worth at least $3 million. This is outrageous. Victoria, please sit down, Gerald said firmly. I am not finished. James was shaking his head. Dad left her more than any of us individually. He barely knew her for 3 years. Sit down, both of you, Gerald said more forcefully. If you want to hear the rest, you need to be quiet and let me finish. Victoria and James sat down, but they looked furious. Elizabeth looked confused and upset. Margaret felt sick. She had not wanted this. She had not wanted to come between Richard and his children. $2 million in the house? It seemed like so much, too much. She opened her mouth to say something, but Gerald was already continuing. Now, regarding the remainder of the estate, Gerald read, the Westmore Industries business holdings, stocks, bonds, real estate investments, and all other assets not previously mentioned are to be placed in a family trust. This trust will be managed by a board consisting of Victoria, James, Elizabeth, and 3 independent trustees I have appointed. Victoria's expression changed. This sounded better. A family trust meant they would control the business and the real money. The income from this trust will be distributed as follows, Gerald continued. 40% to Victoria, 30% to James, 30% to Elizabeth. They will also have voting control over business decisions through the trust structure. The siblings looked at each other. This was more like it. The business and investments were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The income from that trust would be enormous, much more than the $5 million trusts they each received. But Gerald was not done. However, there is one unusual provision that must be fulfilled before any of these arrangements can be finalized and before the trust can be established. Everyone looked at him. Margaret felt a sense of dread. What had Richard done? Gerald pulled out a sealed envelope from his folder. Richard left very specific instructions for this moment. He wrote that before any distributions are made, before any legal proceedings can begin regarding the will, before any contests can be filed, certain conditions must be met. What conditions? Victoria demanded. Gerald looked at the envelope. Richard requested that I read his personal letter to all of you. Then he requested that one specific task be completed here, today, in this office. What task? James asked. Gerald handed the envelope to Margaret. Richard asked that Margaret read his letter aloud to everyone. Saturday came faster than Margaret expected. She spent the morning cleaning the house even though Rosa had already cleaned it 2 days before. She needed something to do with her nervous energy. Richard's children were coming for dinner. His children who had hated her were now coming to her house to look at photos and share memories. She set the dining room table carefully, using the good dishes but keeping everything simple. She did not want to seem like she was showing off. She made a simple dinner: roasted chicken, vegetables, salad. Comfort food, not fancy restaurant food. At 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Margaret's hand shook as she opened the door. Elizabeth stood there holding a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. "Hi," Elizabeth said shyly. "I hope we are not too early." "No, perfect timing," Margaret said, taking the flowers. "Please come in." Victoria and James arrived a few minutes later. They all stood awkwardly in the entryway, looking around the house they had grown up in but had not visited in over 2 years. "You have changed things," Victoria observed, noticing the colorful pillows and plants. "I hope that is okay," Margaret said quickly. "I did not mean to erase—" "No," Victoria interrupted. "It is good. It looks lived in now, comfortable. Mom would have liked it, I think." They moved to the living room and sat down. The silence was uncomfortable at first. Nobody knew quite what to say. Finally, James spoke. "I read Dad's letter. The private one Gerald gave me." "Me too," Elizabeth said softly. Victoria nodded. "I read mine last night. I could not sleep after." Margaret waited, not sure if they wanted to share what the letter said. "Dad told me he was proud of me," James said, "but he also told me I worked too much, just like he did. He said he hoped I would not wait until I was old to learn that there are more important things than money and business." Elizabeth wiped her eyes. "Dad told me he was sorry we did not get to know each other better before he died. He said he hoped I would give you a chance, Margaret. He said you needed family and he hoped we could be that for you." Victoria looked at her hands. "Dad told me I was too hard on people, too quick to judge. He said I inherited his stubborn streak but also his sense of responsibility, and he hoped I would use it to take care of you instead of fighting you." Margaret felt tears building. Even in death, Richard was trying to bring them together. "He loved you all so much," Margaret said. "He talked about you constantly. He was so proud. Victoria, he talked about how smart you are, how you turned around the manufacturing division. James, he showed me articles about your charity work. Elizabeth, he had photos of your children on his phone and showed them to everyone. He had photos of my kids." Elizabeth asked, surprised. "Hundreds," Margaret said. "He missed them terribly. He wanted to see them, but did not want to force you to bring them around when things were so tense." Elizabeth started crying. "I kept the kids from their grandfather because I was being stubborn. They could have known him." "You can tell them about him now," Margaret said gently. "You can share memories and stories. They can still know who he was." They talked for hours. Margaret showed them the music room and how she had set it up. She showed them Richard's practice notebooks, filled with his careful notes and frustrated observations. "Why are my fingers so clumsy?" one note read. "Margaret says I am improving, but I cannot tell." The siblings laughed and cried reading their father's notes. It was like hearing his voice again. Margaret showed them recordings on her phone, not just the final Troy Marai recording, but earlier ones. Richard struggling through simple scales. Richard playing a children's song with obvious concentration. Richard finally playing through a Bach minuet, and then laughing with joy at the end. "I never knew Dad could laugh like that," James said, listening to one recording. "So free and happy." "He was happy," Margaret said. "Music made him happy. Learning made him happy. He was proud of himself in a way I think he had not felt in a long time." Victoria picked up one of Richard's piano books, flipping through the marked-up pages. "He really worked at this. Look at all these notes. Every single day," Margaret confirmed, "even when his hands hurt. Even when he got frustrated. He never gave up." They moved to the dining room for dinner. Margaret served the food, worried it was too simple, but everyone ate with genuine appetite. They swapped stories about Richard. The children shared memories from growing up, family vacations, business trips where Richard brought them along, lessons he taught them about work and life. Margaret shared her memories too. The time Richard tried to surprise her by making dinner and nearly set the kitchen on fire. The time he sang along tunelessly to the radio and made her laugh so hard she cried. The time he bought out an entire flower shop because he could not decide which flowers she would like best. That sounds like Dad, Victoria said with a smile. He never did anything by half measures. Once he decided something was important, he went all in, James agreed. As the evening wore on, the conversation became more honest. Victoria finally brought up the difficult subject. I need to explain why we reacted the way we did, she said. I need you to understand, Margaret, even though it does not excuse how we treated you. You do not have to. Margaret started. No, I do, Victoria insisted. After Mom died, we watched Dad fall apart. He stopped sleeping. He barely ate. He threw himself into work until he was exhausted. We were terrified we would lose him too. Then, 5 years later, suddenly he is getting married to someone we never met, someone so much younger. It felt wrong. It felt like he was being reckless and we needed to protect him. We thought you were taking advantage of a lonely old man, James added bluntly. We thought Dad was having some kind of late-life crisis and making terrible decisions. We were wrong, but that is what we thought. Elizabeth nodded. I was afraid you would hurt him, break his heart or leave him when you got what you wanted. I did not trust that anyone could genuinely love Dad for who he was, not what he had. Margaret listened without interrupting. She needed to hear this, but the truth is, Victoria continued, we were not around enough to see what Dad needed. We were busy with our own lives and families. We visited on holidays but did not really spend time with him. We did not see how lonely he was, you did. You gave him what we should have given him, attention, companionship, purpose. That is not fair to yourselves, Margaret said. You have your own lives. Richard understood that. He was proud that you were independent and successful. But we could have made more time, James said. We chose not to because we were angry about you. We punished Dad for finding happiness because it made us uncomfortable. They sat with that truth for a moment. Then Elizabeth spoke. What was he like at the end? In the hospital? We visited, but we were only there for short periods. Margaret took a breath. This was hard to talk about. He was tired. The medications made him foggy sometimes. But on his clear days, he was still himself. He told jokes with the nurses. He asked about my students by name. He made me read to him from his favorite books. What did he read? Victoria asked. Poetry mostly. He loved Robert Frost. And he loved biographies of composers. He was reading about Beethoven when he got too tired to focus on books anymore. Did he suffer? Elizabeth asked quietly. Margaret thought about how to answer honestly. Sometimes. He had pain that the medications could not fully control. He got frustrated with his body for failing him. But the hospital staff was very good. They kept him as comfortable as possible. Were you with him when he died? James asked. Yes, Margaret said. Elizabeth was holding his other hand. You and Victoria were at the foot of the bed. It was morning. The sun was coming through the window. He just stopped breathing. Very peaceful. They were all crying again. But it was a different kind of crying now. Shared grief instead of isolated pain. After dinner, they moved back to the living room. Margaret brought out photo albums, both old ones from Richard's life before her and new ones from their time together. The old albums showed Catherine and Richard when they were young, the children growing up, family moments frozen in time. Mom was beautiful, Margaret said, looking at photos of Catherine. Richard told me so many stories about her. Did that bother you? Victoria asked. Hearing about our mother? No, Margaret said honestly. I never wanted to replace her. She was part of Richard's life, an important part. He loved her for over 40 years. That does not diminish what he felt for me. There is room in a person's heart for multiple loves. That is a mature way to look at it, Victoria said. It is the truth, Margaret replied. Richard taught me that. He said loving me did not mean he stopped loving your mother. It just meant his heart had more room than he thought. The new photo albums showed Margaret and Richard's time together. Richard at his first piano recital, standing stiffly in front of the piano, looking nervous. Richard and Margaret at a symphony concert, him grinning like a child. Richard in the garden surrounded by the flowers he picked for her. Richard at the hospital, thin and tired but smiling as Margaret held his hand. You took photos of him in the hospital? James asked. He asked me to, Margaret explained. He wanted to document everything. He said someday you might want to see these final months, to know that he was cared for and not alone. Elizabeth held a photo of Richard sleeping in his hospital bed, Margaret asleep in the chair next to him, their hands still linked. You really never left him. Why would I? Margaret asked. He needed me. Most people would have taken a break, Victoria said. Gone home to sleep in a real bed. Hired a private nurse to sit with him. He was my husband, Margaret said simply. There was nowhere else I wanted to be. They looked through all the photos, slowly putting together a picture of Richard's final years that they had missed. They saw him laughing, learning, living. They saw him happy. I am glad he had this, Victoria said finally, gesturing to all the photos. I am glad he was not alone and miserable. I am glad he had you, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret said. That means more than you know. As the evening came to an end, they made plans to meet again. Elizabeth wanted Margaret to meet her children. James wanted to learn more about Richard's piano journey and maybe take a few lessons himself. Victoria asked if she could take some of the photo albums to make copies. At the door as they were leaving, Victoria pulled Margaret aside. I talked to our accountant, she said quietly, about the trust and the estate. Everything Dad did was exactly as he said, designed to give us control of the business while making sure you were comfortable. Okay, Margaret said, not sure where this was going. The trust is worth about $300 million, Victoria continued. The annual income is substantial. We each get 30 to 40% of that income, depending on business performance. Do you understand what I am saying? Margaret shook her head. She was not good with big numbers. I am saying that each of us will make millions of dollars every year from Dad's trust. We are incredibly wealthy. The $5 million trusts we each got directly were like pocket change compared to the trust income. Oh, Margaret said. Meanwhile, Dad left you $2 million in the house. The house is worth maybe $3 million, so $5 million total. Victoria looked at her intently. That is 1%. 1% of the estate value. And we were going to fight you over it. We were going to accuse you of stealing from our family when you got essentially nothing compared to what we got. Margaret had not thought about it that way. She had been so focused on not taking anything that she had not calculated what Richard's children were receiving. If you had really been a gold digger, Victoria continued, you could have pushed Dad to leave you much more. You could have asked for a percentage of the business or income from the trust. You had 2.5 years to manipulate him. But you did not. You took less than 1% of his estate. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Victoria hugged Margaret, a real hug this time, warm and genuine. Thank you for taking care of our father. Thank you for making him happy, and I am sorry it took me so long to see the truth. After they left, Margaret cleaned up the kitchen and thought about the evening. It had gone better than she ever hoped. Richard's children were trying. They were making an effort. Maybe they could build something real. She went upstairs to the bedroom and pulled out her own letter from Richard, the one he had left for her with Gerald. She had not been ready to read it until now. She opened it carefully. My dearest Margaret, it began in Richard's handwriting. If you are reading this, I am gone and you have survived the will reading. I hope my plan worked. I hope my children finally understood what you mean to me and what our marriage truly was. I know you are probably feeling guilty right now about the inheritance. You always felt guilty when I tried to give you anything. But please, Margaret, accept what I left you without guilt. You earned it by giving me 2.5 years of happiness. You earned it by believing in me. You earned it by teaching me that life can surprise you at any age. The house is yours because you made it a home. Keep it or sell it, whatever makes you happy. The money is yours to use however you wish, though I suspect you will donate most of it. That is fine. That is who you are, and I love that about you. I need you to promise me something. Promise me you will not disappear after I am gone. Do not go back to your small apartment and your small life. You have so much to give. Keep teaching. Keep playing. Keep sharing your music with the world. And if my children reach out to you, give them a chance. They are good people who made mistakes out of fear. They can be your family if you let them. I hope they will be. Finally, I want you to know that these 2.5 years with you were a gift. You gave an old man joy and purpose. You taught me it is never too late to learn something new, to try something difficult, to open your heart to love again. Thank you for seeing me, Margaret. Not Richard Westmore the billionaire, but just Richard, the man who wanted to play piano and needed a patient teacher. Live well, my love. Play beautifully. Teach generously, and remember that you changed my life in ways you will never fully understand. All my love, Richard. Margaret read the letter 3 times, crying through each reading. Then she carefully folded it and placed it in the drawer of her nightstand, next to her side of the bed. She changed into pajamas and climbed into bed, into the space that still sometimes smelled like Richard's cologne. She looked at the ceiling and spoke to him as if he could hear her. I think it worked, she said. Your plan. Your children came to dinner. We talked and cried and looked at photos. They are trying, Richard. They really are trying. She paused, then continued. I miss you so much. Every day I turn to tell you something and remember you are not there. I hear music and want to share it with you. I see your piano and remember I will never hear you play again. But I am okay. I am sad, but I am okay. And I promise I will do what you asked. I will keep teaching. I will keep playing. I will give your children a chance to be family. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for believing I could teach you piano. Thank you for every moment we had together. Margaret turned off the light and lay in the darkness. Tomorrow she would go back to the music school. She would teach her students. She would live the life Richard wanted her to live. But tonight she just let herself feel the loss. She let herself grieve for the man who had changed her life in ways she was still discovering. 6 months had passed since Richard died. 6 months since that difficult will reading that changed everything. Margaret was sitting in the music room watching snow fall outside the window. Winter had come, bringing cold and quiet to the city. The house did not feel as empty anymore. Elizabeth visited every Thursday with her 2 children, bringing them for piano lessons with Aunt Margaret, as they now called her. Victoria stopped by on Sundays for coffee and conversation. James came less frequently but always called on Wednesday evenings to check in. They were building something. Not the family Richard had hoped for exactly, but a family nonetheless. It was fragile and new, but it was real. Margaret still taught at Lincoln Community Music School 3 days a week. She had offered to donate money to the school after receiving her inheritance, but the director had been nervous about accepting such a large sum from a teacher. So Margaret had created a foundation instead, using $1 million of the $2 million Richard left her. The Richard Westmore Music Education Foundation provided scholarships, bought instruments, funded school programs, and supported music teachers. The other $1 million she had split between several charities Richard cared about: the symphony, the children's hospital, literacy programs. She kept only enough to cover her living expenses for a few years. Money beyond that did not interest her. People at the music school had stopped whispering about her eventually. Once they saw that she still showed up to teach, still drove her old car, still wore simple clothes, they realized she had not changed. She was still Margaret, the dedicated teacher who stayed late to help struggling students and brought snacks for kids who came to lessons hungry. The house had become what Richard wanted, a place of music and gathering. Margaret hosted regular dinners with Richard's children. She invited her fellow teachers over for casual parties. She opened the music room to students who did not have pianos at home, letting them come practice in the evenings. But Margaret still struggled with loneliness. The house was full of people sometimes, but at night she was alone. She missed Richard's presence, his laugh, his awkward piano playing, his questions about her day. She missed having someone to share her life with. On this particular snowy evening, Margaret was preparing for a special event. Tomorrow was the 1-year anniversary of Richard's death, and the family had planned a memorial concert. They were holding it at the Symphony Hall, with proceeds going to Margaret's foundation. Several professional musicians were performing, but Margaret was also going to play. She was nervous. She had not performed publicly since Richard died. Teaching was one thing, but performing in front of hundreds of people felt overwhelming. Victoria had convinced her to do it, saying Richard would have wanted it. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret answered it to find Elizabeth standing there with a large box. "Hi," Elizabeth said, stamping snow off her boots. "I know I am early, but I found something I wanted to show you before tomorrow." They went to the living room and Elizabeth opened the box. Inside were dozens of old videotapes. "I was going through Mom's things in the attic," Elizabeth explained. "These are old family videos from when we were kids. I had them converted to digital files. I thought you might want to see them, to see what Dad was like when we were young." Margaret was touched. "Thank you. I would love to see them." They spent the next 2 hours watching videos of young Richard playing with his children, teaching them to ride bikes, reading bedtime stories, making silly faces at the camera. Margaret saw a different side of Richard, the devoted father, the playful husband, the man who was confident and strong and in his prime. He was handsome, Margaret said, watching a video of 35-year-old Richard tossing a football with young James. He was, Elizabeth agreed. Mom used to say he never realized how good-looking he was. He was too busy working to care about things like that. One video showed Richard and Catherine dancing at a party. They looked happy and comfortable together, moving in sync the way long-married couples do. "Does it bother you to watch this?" Elizabeth asked. "Seeing Dad with Mom?" "No," Margaret said honestly. "It makes me happy to see he had that. That he knew love and partnership for so many years. I had 2.5 years with him. Your mother had over 40. She gave him 3 beautiful children and a full life. I gave him piano lessons and companionship at the end. Both were valuable. Both were love." Elizabeth hugged her. "You are remarkable, you know that? Most people could not be so generous about their husband's first wife." "Your mother was not a rival," Margaret said. "She was part of Richard's story. If I had been jealous of her, that would have made Richard sad. He loved both of us in different ways at different times in his life. That is okay." They watched more videos, laughing at awkward childhood fashion choices and cringing at embarrassing family moments. Then they came across a video that made Margaret sit forward. It was Richard at a piano maybe 25 years ago. He was younger, his hair darker, sitting at a Christmas party at someone's house. Someone off camera was saying, "Play something, Richard." "I cannot play," young Richard said in the video, laughing. "I never learned?" "Come on, just try," a woman's voice urged. Catherine's voice. Richard put his hands on the piano keys awkwardly and pressed some random notes that made a discordant sound. Everyone laughed, including Richard. "See, told you. I am hopeless with instruments." "You should learn," Catherine said. "It is never too late." "I am 47 years old," Richard replied. "Too old to start something like piano." "You always say things like that," Catherine said affectionately. "Always focused on what you cannot do instead of what you can." The video ended. Elizabeth and Margaret looked at each other. "He wanted to learn even back then?" Margaret said softly. "But he thought he was too old." "At 47? And you convinced him he was not too old at 72, Elizabeth said. "You gave him something he wanted his whole life but thought was impossible." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She had given Richard more than she realized. Not just piano lessons, but the belief that dreams do not have expiration dates. That trying something new is never foolish, no matter your age. "Thank you for showing me this," Margaret said. "It helps me understand him better." Elizabeth stayed for dinner. They talked about the memorial concert, about the children, about work and life and memories. When she left, Margaret felt less alone. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She lay in bed thinking about the past year, about everything that had changed. This time last year, Richard was dying in the hospital. She had been terrified of losing him, terrified of facing life without him, terrified of his children's anger. Now Richard was gone, but she had survived. More than survived, she had built something good from the grief. She had found family. She had created a foundation that would help children learn music for years to come. She had honored Richard's memory by continuing to live the life he loved about her, teaching, giving, believing in people. But she was also tired. Tired of being strong, tired of being alone, tired of sleeping in a big empty house and waking up to silence. Margaret got out of bed and went downstairs to the music room. She sat at Richard's piano, the one he had practiced on every day. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Not Träumerei this time, but Chopin's Nocturne, the piece she had been playing the night she met Richard. As she played, she talked to him like she sometimes did when the loneliness felt too heavy. "I am playing at the memorial concert tomorrow," she said. "Everyone thinks I should play Träumerei, our piece. But I think I want to play this Chopin instead, the piece I was playing when you first heard me. Does that make sense?" She kept playing, the notes filling the empty house. "I think about that night a lot. How you came up to me on the balcony and asked about piano lessons. How nervous I was because you were this important, wealthy man and I was just a music teacher. How you looked at me like I was someone who mattered." Her fingers moved across the keys automatically, muscle memory guiding them through the familiar piece. I never expected to fall in love with you. I thought we would just be friends, maybe. Teacher and student. But you were so much more than I expected. You were funny and curious and kind. You saw me, Richard. Really saw me. That was the greatest gift you gave me." She reached the difficult passage in the middle of the piece, the one that required precise fingerwork. She had played this section 1,000 times, but never perfectly. Tonight, her fingers found exactly the right notes at exactly the right speed. The music soared. "I hope tomorrow goes well. I hope your children do not regret planning this concert. I hope the foundation does good work. I hope I'm making you proud." She finished the piece and sat in silence for a moment. Then she heard something that made her look up. Applause. Someone was clapping. Margaret turned around to see Victoria standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "I am sorry," Victoria said. "The door was unlocked. I should have knocked, but I heard the music and I had to listen." "How long have you been there?" Margaret asked, embarrassed. "Long enough to hear you talking to Dad. Long enough to hear the most beautiful piano playing I have ever heard in person." Victoria came into the room and sat in the comfortable chair. Richard's chair. "That was extraordinary, Margaret." "I did not know that," Margaret said. "He opened it again because of you. Because this became the music room. A place of creation instead of a place of memories. He told me that once, toward the end. He said you had opened up parts of his life that had been closed for years." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while. Then Victoria spoke again. "Can I tell you something? Something I have been feeling guilty about?" "Of course," Margaret said. "Part of me is glad Dad married you instead of someone else. If he had married someone from his own social circle, someone who fit in with his world, I think I would have hated her forever. But you are so completely yourself. You do not care about impressing anyone. You just keep teaching and giving and being genuine. It is hard to hate someone like that." "Were you trying to hate me?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Victoria admitted. "I wanted to hate you. It would have been easier than admitting I was wrong. But you kept being kind even when we were cruel. You kept honoring Dad's memory even when we questioned your motives. You made it impossible to hate you." "I'm not trying to be impressive," Margaret said. "I am just trying to live in a way that would make Richard proud." "You are succeeding," Victoria said. She stood up. "I should go home. My husband is probably wondering where I went. But Margaret, thank you. For everything. For loving Dad. For being patient with us. For tonight letting me intrude on your grief." "You are not intruding," Margaret said. "You are family. You are always welcome here." After Victoria left, Margaret went back to bed. She fell asleep quickly, feeling less alone than she had in months. The next day, the memorial concert was beautiful. The symphony hall was packed with people who had known Richard or had been touched by his charitable work. Professional musicians played Beethoven and Mozart and Bach. The symphony performed a piece Richard had particularly loved. Then it was Margaret's turn. She walked onto the stage in a simple black dress carrying no sheet music. She sat at the grand piano and looked out at the crowd. She saw Richard's children sitting in the front row. She saw her fellow teachers from the school. She saw faces of students and parents and friends. She spoke briefly into the microphone. "Richard Westmore was my husband for 2.5 years. In that time he taught me that it is never too late to try something new, to learn something difficult, to open your heart to love. Tonight I am playing the piece I was performing the night we met. This is for Richard, who heard me play and decided to learn piano himself at age 72. He was braver than he knew." Margaret placed her hands on the keys and began to play Chopin's Nocturne. She played it the way she had played it the night Richard first heard her, with passion and precision and heart. But this time there was an added dimension to her playing. This time she was playing not for strangers at a charity event, but for one man who could not hear it anymore except maybe in spirit. The notes filled the concert hall, delicate and powerful at once. Every person in the audience sat perfectly still, captured by the music. Margaret poured everything into the performance, her grief, her gratitude, her memories, her love. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience rose to their feet, applauding thunderously. Margaret stood and bowed, tears running down her face. She looked at Victoria, James, and Elizabeth in the front row. All three were crying and clapping. Backstage afterward, dozens of people came to thank her and offer condolences. But the most important moment came when Richard's 3 children gathered around her. "Dad heard you play that exact piece the night you met," James said. "You told us that story once, but hearing it tonight, I finally understood what he heard, what made him fall in love with you." "It was not just the music," Elizabeth added. "It was the emotion behind it. The way you give yourself completely to whatever you do. Dad saw that in you from the start." Victoria hugged Margaret tightly. "Thank you. For tonight, for the last year, for everything. I should be thanking you," Margaret said, "for giving me a chance, for becoming family." "We are family," Victoria confirmed. "That is not going to change. You are stuck with us now." They went to dinner after the concert, the 4 of them, sharing stories about Richard and laughing at memories. People at nearby tables probably wondered who they were. 2 young women, a young man and a slightly older woman, clearly not related by blood but connected by something strong. They were family, bound not by DNA but by their shared love for a man who had brought them together even after his death. Over the following months, the family grew closer. Elizabeth's children started calling Margaret Aunt Maggie and begged to come to piano lessons. James started taking lessons himself, struggling through the same basic exercises his father had mastered. Victoria joined the board of Margaret's foundation, using her business skills to help it grow. The foundation expanded its reach, eventually serving 5 school districts and helping hundreds of children learn music. Every scholarship recipient received a letter explaining that the money came from Richard Westmore, a man who learned piano at 72, because he believed it was never too late to pursue beauty and knowledge. Margaret continued teaching at Lincoln Community Music School. She could have retired, could have focused only on the foundation, but she loved the daily interaction with students. She loved watching children discover their talents. She loved being in the small practice rooms where the walls echoed with scales and songs and occasional frustrated sighs. 2 years after Richard's death, on what would have been his 75th birthday, the family gathered at the house for dinner. Margaret had cooked Richard's favorite meal. They looked through photo albums and watched old videos. James played a simple piece on the piano, the same piece Richard had been working on when he died. "Dad would be happy to see this," Elizabeth said, looking around the table at everyone gathered. "All of us together. This is what he wanted." "He was a smart man," Victoria said. "He knew exactly how to make us see the truth. That recording at the will reading, it changed everything." "He spent weeks planning that," Margaret said. "He recorded his message multiple times to get it right. He wanted to make sure you understood." "We understand now," James said. "We understand that you made Dad happy in a way he had not been in years. We understand that love does not have to make sense to other people. It just has to be real." "It was real," Margaret said softly. "Every moment of it was real." As the evening ended and everyone prepared to leave, Victoria pulled Margaret aside one more time. "There is something I have been wanting to ask you," Victoria said, "but I did not know if it was appropriate." "What is it?" Margaret asked. "James and I were thinking, would you consider joining the board of Westmore Industries? Not as an executive, but as an advisor. Someone who can remind us about the values Dad cared about. Someone who can push us to be generous and thoughtful in our business decisions." Margaret was surprised. "I do not know anything about business." "Exactly," Victoria said. "You know about people and compassion and doing the right thing. That is what we need. Please think about it." Margaret promised to consider it. As she closed the door behind the last guest and turned to look at the empty house, she did not feel lonely. The house was full of memories now. Good memories of family and music and laughter. She went to the music room and sat at Richard's piano one more time. She did not play. She just sat there, her hands resting gently on the keys, feeling connected to the man who had practiced here so diligently. "I think we did it," she said to Richard. "Your children and I, we became family like you hoped. The foundation is doing good work. The house is full of life again. I am still teaching, still sharing music, still trying to be the person you believed I was." She smiled, thinking about how much had changed since that night at the charity gala 3.5 years ago. She had been a lonely piano teacher playing background music. Now she was part of a family, running a foundation, making a difference in children's lives. "Thank you for believing I could teach you piano," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for those 2.5 years. They were short, but they changed everything." Margaret stood up and turned off the light in the music room. Tomorrow she would go to the school and teach. Tomorrow Victoria would call with foundation business. Tomorrow Elizabeth would drop off the kids for lessons. Tomorrow life would continue, full and purposeful and good. But tonight she just felt grateful. Grateful for the time she had with Richard. Grateful for the family they had built together. Grateful for music and memory and love. The house was quiet as Margaret climbed the stairs to bed. But it was not the empty quiet of loneliness. It was the peaceful quiet of a home full of love even when no one else was there. And in that quiet, if you listened carefully, you might hear the echo of an old man practicing piano, his fingers stiff but determined, playing the same measure over and over until he got it right. Because it is never too late to learn something new. It is never too late to try. And love, real love, sees people for who they truly are, not for what they have or how old they are or what the world thinks they should be. That was Richard's final gift to all of them. The reminder that genuine human connection,